All right, this is Block 3, Section 5. Why did Great Britain lose? Which is a different question from why America won in a couple different ways. If you look at the beginning of the war, there's no reason that the 13 colonies should have ever have been able to actually beat Great Britain. Great Britain was the most powerful country in the world, had the world's largest navy, had a crack professional army of trained and efficient troops, and on the other side was these 13 squabbling, disorganized colonies that were kind of daring to go up against the power of the king's army and navy. But yet, 8 years later, Great Britain was signing a peace treaty that not only gave America its independence, but also gave it that independence on very, very favorable terms. The question that we need to ask is why? Why did Britain lose this war? And there are kind of four basic thematic reasons. Let's start with the military ones, which in one sense are the most important. It was a military conflict. But to understand the others, we kind of have to understand the military ones first. The first problem was that Britain was fighting in America, which is 3,000 miles and a month-long ship journey away from England. So you're talking about very long supply lines that for supplies and reinforcements to reach the theater of war, they had to come all the way from England, 3,000 miles away. So anytime you are dealing with long supply lines and a long supply chain, you're already immediately at a disadvantage. The commanders that commanded the British Army during the war, men like Lord General Howe, General Cornwallis, were not the greatest soldiers that Great Britain has ever produced. That historical opinion on the soldiers of Great Britain in the Revolutionary War is mediocre at best and less than mediocre in many occasions. So off the bat, you're dealing with long supply lines and mediocre commanders. The tactics that the British are using throughout the war are a little bit outmoded and for the time and place that they were fighting. The Americans, for the last 150 years before the Revolutionary War, have been fighting Indians. They are well versed in Indian tactics of movement, concealment, surprise, and the kind of concentration of force at an important part. The British Army is used to fighting in Europe, which had different needs and different tactics. And that kind of leads to the other military problem that the British had. The British, with their army, could not efficiently operate in the largeness of the United States. That whenever the British Army was on the coast and the areas were kind of small and they could be resupplied with their navy, they pretty much won every battle. But when you got the British Army into the back country, it started to get worn down real quick. That the British Army European fighting is large armies in small places. And all of European tactics kind of went off of that fact. Large armies, small places. America, the United States, you're dealing with small armies in huge places. So in the campaign in the Carolinas that we're going to see, just the British Army ended up moving all around, chasing American armies and just exhausting itself. The same thing happened in the backwoods of Virginia. The same thing happened even as outside of Philadelphia. The same thing happened in northern New York, that the more these relatively small British armies had to cover these large distances, the armies got worn down. They could be attacked from the flanks, attacked from the sides, and just kind of worn out was another military reason the British lost. You're dealing with unfamiliar situations, small armies, big places. And finally, the British High Command had very little respect for the Loyalists in America that were willing to fight for their king. And there was never an attempt by the British to organize and efficiently arm the Loyalists, either under their own commanders or under British commanders. They had the kind of same disrespect for the Loyalists' military ability as they did for the colonists' military ability. So although at least 20 to 25% of Americans were loyal to king and country, they were never used as an army by the British. So there's a good list of some military reasons why the British lost. And then you have to get into kind of broader reasons, that in the end, even with all of those military problems, if Great Britain had not been diplomatically isolated, they still probably would have beat the Americans. But as soon as France came into the war, Britain did not have a single ally, and in fact was fighting much of Europe. Great Britain at the outset of the war is the most powerful country in the world. You have learned that, after the French and Indian War, the French are kind of looking for revenge on the Brits. And when the French kind of realized, due to some American military successes, when the French realized that this rebellion had a chance of success, they jumped into the war, not to help, helping the Americans was kind of the subsidiary reason, but in reality, they were looking to hurt the British. And then joining France in the war with Holland and Spain. So you had the three most powerful countries in Europe all aligned against the British, and the British could not find a single ally. They had annoyed the Prussians, the Russians were not getting involved, the Portuguese refused to help. So you had the three most powerful countries in Europe, besides England, France, Holland, Spain, all fighting the English, who could get no help themselves. And that's just poor diplomacy on the part of the British. It's poor long-term strategic planning, and it's poor diplomacy. So by 1777, the British are not even really focused on the war in America as much as they are focused on now this world conflict, this global conflict, that not only are they trying to get their colonies back, but they are trying to defend their colonies in the Caribbean, they are trying to defend their colonies in India, they are trying to defend their colonies all over the world from combined attacks by the British, the French, by the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish. And because of their diplomatic isolation, the British could not any longer focus solely on bringing the colonies to heel. Once the war started dragging on, and now Britain is truly fighting this world war alone against the Americans, against the French, against the Spanish, against the Dutch, and Britain's economy starts to suffer. Merchants are losing their trade. All of a sudden, the sea lanes are no longer safe. People are losing money. And when people are losing lots of money, especially important people in the business community are losing money, they start to put pressure on political leaders to end the war, call for peace. That Britain had this very wonderful trading relationship with its colonies before the war, and many businessmen came to realize that they could have that excellent economic relationship with whoever was in Massachusetts, whether it was a colony or whether it was an independent country. So pressure began to be put on Parliament, on politicians in England, to end the war. And that kind of links us into our fourth reason, our political reasons why Britain lost the war. First of all, King George III is really kind of the last British monarch who tries to rule personally. That after George kind of goes insane and then dies, you get the ending of royal power in England. And like I've said before, I'll say it again, if you ever have a chance to take a course on British history, take one, very interesting. But George III was a well-meaning man. He's not an evil character like, he was portrayed in a lot of American propaganda. But he was no brilliant tactician and no brilliant strategist. And people who are not particularly brilliant tend to surround themselves with advisors that are not particularly brilliant. George's prime minister, Lord North, was terrible, and the minister for the colonies, Lord George Germain, was just as bad. So at the pinnacle of British leadership, George III, Lord North, Lord Germain, you have some serious mediocrities. Compare that to the type of men that the Americans had at their head, starting with George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, the Marquis de Lafayette. You're talking about some historically brilliant and important people at the head of the American effort here. As time goes on, as we referenced earlier, there starts to be the businessmen and mercantile and commercial interests in Britain start putting pressure on their politicians to call for peace. There is a significant anti-war movement among the British merchant and commercial classes. A well-known British, kind of politician, writer, philosopher, Edmund Burke, starts arguing that Britain should give Americans their independence. It's only their right. And so that's kind of the commercial elite and kind of, some people in Parliament. And just for your ordinary Englishman, the costs of fighting the war started to get high. Taxes started to go up on ordinary Britons who were highly taxed to begin with. And all of these things led in 1782 to parliamentary elections where Lord North and George Germain and the King's Party were kind of thrown out of power. And they were replaced by men like Edmund Burke, who was willing to deal with the Americans. So all in all, a lot of things had to come together for the Americans to win this war and for the British to lose it. We talked about some military disadvantages the British were at. We talked about the significant diplomatic disadvantage the British were at. We talked about how the long ongoing war hurt business and commercial interests in England. And we talked about how Britain's political leaders were kind of mediocre, and eventually political pressure led to a change in government and brought in a government of people willing to deal with the Americans on an equal basis. The Americans themselves played a large role. Obviously, George Washington had to keep his army in the field. The Americans had to prove at the outset that they could beat the English. They had to set up a government, get funding. So there's kind of two things going on here, two general things. Number one is the Americans had to do a lot of things to win the war, but Britain also had to do a lot of things to lose it. And by 1783, the United States is an independent country.